famous pianist told blind black girl to play just for fun, but she has an amazing gift that would forever change the lives of everyone in that room. How cute. Come here, sweetie, play something for us to enjoy. Victoria Hartwell's honeyed voice echoed through the gilded hall of the Metropolitan Arts Club, eliciting muffled giggles from the guests at Chicago's most exclusive charity event. Amelia Johnson, just 14 years old, stood motionless beside the Steinway grand piano that dominated the center of the elegant hall. Her small hands gripped the white cane tightly as an awkward silence filled the room. The girl had arrived with her public school principal, who had obtained 2 complimentary tickets to the annual fundraising gala for musical inclusion programs. Victoria adjusted her designer dress and smiled at the audience of businesspeople, music critics, and philanthropists. At 38, she was considered one of the greatest Chopin performers of our time, with sold-out world tours and million-dollar contracts. To her, that out-of-place girl represented everything that was wrong with forced diversity policies at cultural events. "Don't be shy, dear," Victoria insisted, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure our generous donors would love to see how we invest in inclusion." How about happy birthday? Everyone knows that one. Mrs. Catherine Morrison, president of the organizing foundation, muttered something about inappropriate to her assistant, but did not intervene. After all, Victoria Hartwell was the star of the evening, responsible for raising millions for the institution. Amelia took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around her cane. No one there knew that she spent 10 hours a day practicing on a borrowed keyboard in the basement of the neighborhood church. No one knew that at age 4 she could reproduce entire symphonies after hearing them only once. And most importantly, no one imagined that at that moment, while everyone saw her as an inconvenient obstacle, she was memorizing every note, every chord, every nuance of the arrogance that hung in the air. "Actually," said Amelia, her calm voice cutting through the buzz of side conversations, "I prefer Rachmaninoff." Victoria let out a genuine laugh. "Rachmaninoff? Really? And what piece could you possibly play, young lady?" The famous pianist's smile was about to freeze on her face when Amelia replied with a serenity that only exists in those who carry a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. "Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor. But perhaps it's too advanced for this audience." The silence that followed was so thick you could hear the ticking of the old clock in the entrance hall. There was something about that girl's posture, the quiet confidence of her words, that made some guests realize they were about to witness something far beyond simple humiliation. If you're enjoying this story of overcoming prejudice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a moment of mockery would turn into the most devastating lesson the Chicago musical elite would ever receive. Victoria felt a growing irritation at the girl's unexpected response. "Rachmaninoff? Concerto No. 2. That girl was clearly trying to impress by using names she probably couldn't even pronounce properly. Too advanced for this audience?" Victoria repeated, her voice completely losing its artificial sweetness. "Young lady, you are speaking to people who finance entire orchestras. Perhaps you don't understand where you are." The audience murmured in agreement. Margaret Whitfield, heir to a banking empire and the foundation's main sponsor, whispered loudly enough to be heard, "How rude. Someone needs to teach this generation some manners." Amelia remained motionless, but something in the way she held her cane changed subtly. Her fingers no longer trembled. On the contrary, they were completely relaxed, like those of a surgeon before a delicate operation. "Victoria," interrupted Dr. Michael Chun, conductor of the Boston Symphony who was visiting the event. "Perhaps we should continue with the main program." "No," Victoria cut in, now clearly irritated by the perceived insubordination. Young Amelia here seemed to question the sophistication of our guests. "I think it's only fair that she demonstrate this musical superiority she's implying." Victoria walked over to the piano and played the first notes of the concerto with exaggerated, almost theatrical movements. "You see, Amelia? This is a piece that requires not only technique, but emotional maturity. Something that takes decades to develop. Are you sure you want to expose yourself like this?" What Victoria didn't know was that Amelia knew every nuance of that performance. For the past 8 years, since she lost her sight in a car accident that also took her parents, she had devoted every free moment to music. Not as a hobby or natural talent, but out of necessity. It was her only way to process a pain that words could not reach. Her Aunt Dorothy, who worked as a cleaning lady at the Municipal Conservatory, had gained access to rare recordings and sheet music in Braille. Amelia had memorized hundreds of pieces, studying not only the notes, but the historical interpretations, regional variations, and emotional contexts of each composer. Dr. Hartwell, Amelia said, deliberately using the wrong title. You played the first notes in E-flat major. Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2 is in C minor. An icy silence fell over the room. Victoria felt the blood rush to her face. She had changed the key on purpose to test whether the girl really knew the piece, but she hadn't expected to be corrected in public. It was obviously intentional, Victoria lied, her voice losing its smooth polish. I was testing her basic musical ear. I see, Amelia replied with a calmness that made some guests shift uncomfortably in their chairs. Then you must also know that Rachmaninoff composed this concerto during his battle with severe depression, following the failure of his first symphony. Each movement reflects a stage in the struggle against despair. That's why playing it correctly requires more than technique. It requires having known true darkness. The statement hit Victoria like a punch in the stomach. Her own interpretation of the piece had always been technically perfect, but cold, lacking the emotional depth that true connoisseurs always noticed but never dared to comment on. Very well, said Victoria, her mask of superiority beginning to crack. Since you are so knowledgeable about music theory, how about showing us in practice? Or would you rather continue to impress us with your encyclopedic knowledge? Catherine Morrison whispered urgently to her assistant, "This is getting embarrassing. Maybe we should intervene." But Victoria was determined to humiliate that girl once and for all. Actually, she continued with a cruel smile, I'll make it more interesting. If you can play at least the first movement decently, I will personally guarantee that your school will receive a donation of $10,000. The audience cheered at the wager. It was a considerable sum for a public school. But, Victoria added, her voice dripping with malice, when you fail, and you will fail, I want you to publicly admit that you tried to draw attention to yourself with superficial knowledge that you cannot sustain in practice. Do you accept the challenge? Dr. Chen frowned, as if sensing something that the others could not yet grasp. In the fifth row, Dorothy Thompson immediately recognized the tone in her niece's voice. It was the same one she used before solving impossible math problems, or when she was about to demonstrate something she had prepared in secret. I accept, Amelia said simply. But I would like to make a small change to the proposal. Victoria laughed contemptuously. Change? Honey, you're in no position to negotiate. Instead of $10,000 for my school if I succeed, Amelia said, her voice carrying an authority that made the entire room pay attention. How about $50,000 if I manage to play not just the first movement, but the entire concerto? From memory. A murmur of surprise rippled through the audience. Victoria hesitated for a moment. $50,000 was a significant amount, even for her. And if I fail, Amelia continued, I promise never to participate in events like this again. Ever. Victoria smiled, thinking she had found the perfect opportunity to get rid of that inconvenient girl once and for all. Done. But I want witnesses. Dr. Chun, will you agree to be the judge of this demonstration? What those privileged people couldn't see was that every condescending word, every pitying glance, every attempt to belittle her was fueling something much more powerful than indignation. It was awakening the kind of strength that only comes from suffering transformed into purpose. And Amelia was about to show that underestimating someone who has lost everything is the most dangerous mistake one can make. Dr. Chen nodded in agreement, clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. Very well. As an impartial judge, I confirm the terms, Rachmaninoff's complete concerto for memory, in exchange for $50,000 for the young woman's school if she succeeds, or her promise never to appear at cultural events again if she fails. Victoria smiled with cruel satisfaction. $50,000 was an amount she could easily spend on a single piece of jewelry, but for a public school it would be transformative. Of course the girl would fail. It was mathematically impossible for someone her age, without proper classical training, to perform one of the most complex pieces in the piano repertoire. I need a few minutes to prepare, Amelia said calmly. Of course, dear, Victoria replied with false kindness. Would you like some water? Perhaps a moment to reconsider this madness. Amelia walked away toward the back of the hall, where there was a more private area. What no one noticed was Dorothy Thompson discreetly getting up from the fifth row and walking in the same direction. Aunt Dorothy, Amelia whispered when her aunt approached. My girl, Dorothy murmured, hugging her niece. "Are you sure about this? It's a lot of pressure, even for you." Dorothy knew better than anyone what Amelia was capable of. As a cleaning lady at the Municipal Conservatory for 15 years, she had witnessed hundreds of classes and masterclasses. She had heard teachers comment on musical prodigies, witnessed auditions of young talent, and never, not once, had she encountered anyone with the natural musical ability her niece possessed. "She has no idea what's about to happen," Amelia replied, her hands moving unconsciously as if she were playing the piano in the air. "Auntie, do you remember Professor Martinez?" Dorothy smiled. Of course she remembered. Professor Martinez was the legendary piano instructor at the conservatory, now retired, whom Dorothy had met during her early years of work. When she discovered Amelia's extraordinary talent, she had asked the old master for an impossible favor, to give secret lessons to a blind girl from the suburbs. "He still comes in on Tuesdays and Thursdays to use the grand piano in room 12, Dorothy said. "He said you're the most promising student he's had in his 50-year career." What the elite audience didn't know was that for the past 5 years, Amelia had received direct instruction from one of the greatest pianists the country had ever produced. Professor Martinez, winner of 3 international awards and former soloist with the National Philharmonic, had been so impressed with Amelia's raw talent that he had broken his own rule of retirement. "That woman thinks she's humiliating an amateur girl," Amelia continued, her voice carrying a quiet confidence. "In fact, she's challenging someone who has spent the last 5 years preparing specifically for this moment." Professor Martinez had been much more than an instructor to Amelia. He had been a mentor, a confidant, and most importantly, someone who believed in her potential when the whole world saw her as just a girl with a disability. Under his tutelage, she had not only mastered classical techniques, she had transcended them. "Remember the recording you brought of Vladimir Ashkenazy's recital, playing this same concerto?" Amelia asked. Dorothy nodded. 3 years ago, she had obtained a rare recording of one of the most celebrated performances of Rachmaninoff's Concerto No. 2. Amelia had listened to it obsessively, analyzing every nuance, every interpretive choice, every musical breath. "I studied that performance for months. But Professor Martinez taught me something that even Ashkenazy didn't know at the time. Rachmaninoff left personal notes in the margins of his original scores, indications of dynamics and expression that were never officially published." Professor Martinez had had access to these original scores during his studies in Moscow in the 1970s. He had shared these secrets only with Amelia, recognizing in her not only technical talent, but the emotional maturity necessary to interpret Rachmaninoff authentically. Back in the main hall, Victoria checked her watch with theatrical impatience. How much longer does this girl need? Perhaps she is realizing the magnitude of the mistake she is about to make. Margaret Whitfield laughed softly. "Frankly, Victoria, you are being very patient. Any serious teacher would have ended this circus long ago." Dr. Chun, meanwhile, watched the interaction between Amelia and her aunt with growing curiosity. There was something in the posture of those two women, an intimacy and confidence that suggested shared knowledge. The aunt did not seem concerned about the impossible challenge Amelia had accepted. She seemed, in fact, proud. "Dorothy," Amelia whispered, "do you remember what Professor Martinez said about performances that change lives?" Dorothy smiled, recalling the old master's words. "There are technical performances, and there are performances that touch the soul. The former impresses critics. The latter transforms people." "This isn't going to be just a technically perfect performance," Amelia continued. "It's going to be a lesson in how true talent is not limited by color, social class, or disability. And more importantly, it's going to be a demonstration that underestimating someone based on prejudice is the most costly mistake one can make." During her years of secret preparation, Amelia had developed not only extraordinary technical skill, but a deep understanding of musical psychology. She knew exactly how to use music to communicate messages that transcended words. "Professor Martinez taught me that every note of Rachmaninoff carries a specific emotion," Amelia said, her fingers moving unconsciously. "He composed this concerto out of a deep depression. Each movement represents a stage in the journey back to the light." What Victoria and her privileged guests did not understand was that Amelia had an advantage none of them possessed. She had actually lived that journey. The loss, the despair, the slow rebuilding of hope, and finally, the triumph over adversity. "It's time," announced Dorothy, watching Victoria make impatient gestures. Amelia nodded, taking a deep breath. "When I start playing, That woman will realize she has made the biggest mistake of her career. But when I finish, she will understand that she has just witnessed something she will never be able to reproduce." The two walked back to the center of the hall, where Victoria waited with ill-concealed irritation. Finally, Victoria muttered, "I hope you've used this time to reconsider your rash decision." Amelia approached the piano, her hands finding the keys with the familiarity of someone who had played this same piece hundreds of times in secret. But this time would be different. This time, she wouldn't just be playing for Professor Martinez in the empty conservatory room. This time, she would be playing to rewrite the perceptions of a musical elite who had spent the entire evening underestimating her. "One last question before we begin," Amelia said, turning slightly toward the audience. "Have any of you ever had to completely rebuild your soul after losing everything in a single moment?" The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. There was an intensity in Amelia's voice, an authority born of real experience, that made some guests realize they were about to witness something far beyond a simple musical demonstration. Victoria felt a chill of apprehension. There was something about the girl's posture, the way her hands hovered over the keys, that suggested the evening would not follow the humiliating script she had planned. But it was too late to back down. The entire hall was waiting, and her reputation depended on publicly exposing the inadequacy of that inconvenient girl. What those privileged people couldn't see was that every condescending word, every look of contempt, every attempt to belittle her was fueling something much more powerful than indignation. It was the silent strength of someone who had transformed years of adversity into musical purpose, and who was about to use every note of Rachmaninoff to demonstrate that true talent knows no barriers imposed by those who fear greatness in others. Amelia placed her hands on the keys of the Steinway, and something extraordinary happened in the hall. The first chord that emerged from the piano made Victoria Sterling involuntarily take a step back. It wasn't just the same notes she had played minutes before, it was the same notes transfigured by a soul that had known darkness and found light through music. The first musical phrases of the concerto flowed from Amelia's fingers, as if she were conversing directly with Rachmaninoff across the centuries. Each passage carried the weight of her own experience, the brutal denial of loss at age 8, the anger at a world that saw her only as an obstacle, and finally, the transformative acceptance that had shaped her sacred relationship with music. "My God," whispered Dr. Chun, leaning forward in his chair. In his 40-year musical career, he had never heard a performance with such emotional depth. Victoria felt her legs tremble. The girl's technique was not only flawless, it was superior to her own. The passages she played with concentrated effort flowed from Amelia's fingers like crystal-clear water, as natural and inevitable as breathing. Margaret Whitfield, who minutes earlier had scoffed at the girl's audacity, now had tears streaming down her carefully made-up cheeks. Amelia's music was not only technically perfect, it was transformative, touching places in her soul she had forgotten existed. "How is this possible?" Catherine Morrison murmured to her assistant, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. The answer came in the form of the music itself. Amelia wasn't just playing the concerto, she was retelling her story through it. The first movement became the narrative of a child who lost everything in an instant. The second, the fury of a teenager forced to navigate a world that saw her as inferior before even getting to know her. Victoria watched, paralyzed, as her own interpretation was systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something infinitely more powerful. Every musical choice she had made for decades, technically correct but emotionally empty, was being exposed by the raw genius of the girl she had tried to humiliate. "Victoria," whispered Dr. Chun, his voice heavy with awe, "this girl is one of the greatest natural talents I have ever witnessed." Victoria felt something shatter inside her chest. It wasn't just her pride. It was the entire structure of superiority she had built throughout her life. That blind black girl from the suburbs wasn't just better than her, she was better than any pianist Victoria had ever known. When Amelia reached the third movement, something extraordinary happened in the hall. The movement, which represents acceptance and transcendence in Rachmaninoff's philosophy, took on an almost spiritual dimension. Amelia was no longer playing for the audience. She was playing through them, connecting every person in the hall to the universal experience of loss and rebirth. The entire hall was now completely silent, except for the transcendent music flowing from the piano. People who had come there to flaunt their social status were now confronted with something genuine and too powerful to be ignored or diminished. "She memorized our entire conversation," Victoria murmured to herself, the realization striking her like lightning. Every condescending tone, every word of contempt. She knew exactly what she was doing. In the fifth row, Dorothy Thompson smiled through her tears. She had watched Amelia practice until her hands bled, study Braille sheet music until the wee hours of the morning, memorize interpretations of long-dead masters. Now, finally, the world was witnessing what she had always known existed. When Amelia reached the most complex cadence of the second movement, a passage that often broke experienced pianists, her fingers danced across the keys with an ease that made Dr. Chun lean forward in disbelief. This was not just amateur skill developed in secret. It was musical genius forged in adversity. Victoria looked around the hall and saw her own destruction reflected in the faces of the musical elite. Margaret Whitfield watched her with an expression that mixed disappointment and revulsion. Dr. Chun shook his head slowly, clearly re-evaluating everything he thought about Victoria Sterling. "How dare you," whispered Catherine Morrison, her gaze fixed on Victoria, "try to humiliate a child with such an extraordinary gift." Victoria tried to form a response, but the words died in her throat. There was no explanation that could justify what she had done. She had tried to use her privileged position to crush a girl who represented everything music should be: pure, honest, and transformative. At the absolute climax of the concert, Amelia performed a variation in the interpretation that made the entire hall hold its breath. They were Rachmaninoff's secret notes that Professor Martinez had shared only with her, indications of dynamics and expression that had never been officially published. Victoria immediately recognized their historical authenticity, knowing that only someone with access to extremely rare academic sources could know such details. "That's impossible," Victoria murmured, her hands trembling. "Those variations, they're in the original Moscow scores." As a girl from the suburbs, the realization hit Victoria like a tsunami. Amelia wasn't just a self-taught prodigy. She had received world-class instruction, most likely from some master who had recognized her extraordinary talent. Every prejudiced assumption Victoria had made was being systematically destroyed note by note. As Amelia neared the end of the concert, something magical happened in the hall. The music was no longer just sound, it was pure emotion being transmitted through the keys, touching every heart present in a way that words could never achieve. Victoria watched, mesmerized by horror, as people from the musical elite began to weep openly. It was not just because of the beauty of the music, but because of the realization that they had witnessed something transcendent almost being destroyed by pure prejudice. Amelia concluded the concert with a delicacy that made the ensuing silence seem sacred. Her hands remained on the keys for a moment, as if sealing a pact with the music she had just released. When she finally stood up and turned to face the audience, there was no arrogant triumph on her face, only the quiet dignity of someone who had shared her soul and knew she had honored both Rachmaninoff and her own journey. The ovation that followed was unlike anything that Hall had ever witnessed. It wasn't just applause, it was simultaneous recognition, apology, and celebration. People rose as if they were in the presence of something divine. Victoria stood motionless, watching her reputation being rewritten in real time. Every person in the hall now knew that she had tried to crush a musical genius out of pure prejudice. In 15 minutes, Amelia had completely destroyed the image Victoria had spent decades building. "Mrs. Hartwell," said Dr. Chun, approaching with an expression that mixed disappointment and contempt, "I think we have a lot to talk about regarding the future of your contracts with serious orchestras." Margaret Whitfield took out her phone, and Victoria knew instinctively that news of her humiliation would circulate among the cultural elite before she even left the building. Amelia approached Victoria, extending her hand. "Thank you for the opportunity to play, Mrs. Hartwell. Sometimes we need to be confronted with our own music to understand who we really are." Victoria shook the girl's hand with trembling fingers, finally realizing that she had just witnessed not only an extraordinary performance, but her own complete social downfall. As Amelia received compliments from the entire elite in attendance, Victoria Sterling, the woman who had tried to use privilege to crush talent, discovered that music, like justice, has its own ways of balancing the scales of life. In the center of that hall where discrimination disguised as tradition had once reigned, a new reality was now taking shape, proving that true excellence knows no color, social class, or limitations imposed by those who fear greatness in others. 6 months after that historic night at the Metropolitan Arts Club, Amelia Johnson walked the halls of the prestigious Juilliard Academy as a full scholarship student. At 15, she had become the youngest student in history to receive full funding from the institution. Dr. Chun, who had witnessed her devastating performance, had personally ensured that she received the best educational opportunities available. Talent like this comes along once in a generation, he repeated to anyone who questioned investing so much in a girl from the suburbs. Margaret Whitfield, who had once mocked her, now personally funded her studies and established a foundation to identify other neglected musical talents in underserved communities. "That girl taught me that privilege without purpose is just waste," she confessed in an interview with the Chicago Tribune. While Amelia flourished, Victoria Hartwell faced a very different reality. Her contracts with major orchestras were cancelled one by one. The video of Amelia's performance and the cruel attempt at humiliation that preceded it had gone viral, accumulating millions of views and devastating comments about prejudice disguised as cultural elitism. Victoria had attempted a European tour, but even there, the story had caught up with her. Music critics wrote reviews that questioned not only her technique, but her humanity. "Hartwell plays the right notes, but her music lacks the soul we witnessed in that young prodigy," wrote the influential Guardian critic. Catherine Morrison was forced to resign after the public exposure of how she had allowed charity events to become stages for discrimination. The board of directors made it clear that associating the institution's image with prejudice was unacceptable. 2 years later, Amelia would release her first album, which would become the best-selling classical music album of the decade. Victoria continued to give private lessons at a community school, her international career permanently destroyed by her own arrogance. The difference between them was not just professional success, but how each had chosen to use her talent. Amelia used her music to uplift others, establishing educational programs in underserved communities. Victoria had used hers to elevate herself above others, until she discovered that heights built on prejudice always come crashing down. As Amelia always told young students who face discrimination, the best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but to build something greater than they could ever imagine. Have you ever witnessed talent being wasted because of prejudice? How did you react when you saw injustice being disguised as tradition? Leave your experiences in the comments and subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true merit always trumps empty privilege.